Yo, check this out. This is Wayne Wonder, representing for Warwick LTV. You see the vision, don't it? See the vision. Warwick LTV. Keep it locked.
I'm gonna tell you. We, as bloggers, these are the issues that we need to address. You understand what I said? Yes, set the bar for the youth. Share, like, and subscribe, and stay tuned to the channel. I don't know all this. Yes, brothers and sisters. Greetings once again in the mighty name of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I, and all things good and wonderful amongst us. Welcome viewers and subscribers. Viewers, if you like the content, subscribe and make it help grow the platform. You know, see, I will give thanks. See, and based on the fact say it was just Leonard Howell's birthday, we are going to do some Levication. You see, we are do some Levication and read a few documents regarding the life and times of Leonard Howell and his contribution to Rastafari. You know, see it, so bear with I and make we deal with that one here. You know, the mighty name of Rastafari. Yes, you know, see it. So this is the second reading and hope the item receive it. See, we give thanks. So the early attacks on Howell, yeah? Anthony Boggs has established the link between the Rastafari and the radical African tradition, which had roots in Ethiopianism in the United States and the Back to Africa movement of the late 19th century, and both inspired by Ethiopia's defeat of Italy at Adwa in 1896. However, the suppression of Rastafari's leading figure began before he started preaching African radicalism, before his promotion of the subversive notion of the divinity of Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Howell's suppression began on the day after his return to Jamaica in 1932, when the island's biggest newspaper, Daily Gleaner, published a notice of his arrival. This newspaper, to put the event in context, was established in 1934 by Jewish Jamaican brothers Joshua and Jacob. A long time the Jews controlled the media, you know, from 1930. 1834. Their father ran a coffee plantation in St. Catherine Parish, and in the same year as the abolition of slavery, his sons established the island's most widely read chronicle, which would in time provide a daily account of the new society to be created in the aftermath of African freedom. The Gleaner was born at the moment that African freedom became a reality in British Jamaica. Writing later, John Bigelow would observe how greatly even coffee planters like the Decardovers had suffered because of African freedom. Yo, yeah, I never even continue. Bigelow had reported in 18... Well, I'm going to tell you, also January, it's the last year. Bigelow had reported in 1851 that the abolition of slavery had started out of cultivation over 200,000 acres, which were cultivated with coffee, and this meant in excess of 500 plantations, which in 1832 required the labor of over 30,000 men. Enslaved people, the Decardovers remained at the helm of the Gleaner until long after Howell's return to Jamaica. Michael Decardover was the last one to occupy the post of managing director, which he demoted in 1948. Howell had returned on the 17th of November 1932 on a steamer, the Six Saola, which had sailed from New York to Kingston. The next day, the notice in the Gleaner claimed that Howell had been living in the United States illegally and was deported for overstaying his time, implying that he was a suspicious character and the colonial government should keep an eye on him. At this point, his leadership as Rastafari movement had not yet begun, but Howell was a good target for the Gleaner because he was a black man who possibly had broken the law in the United States and was therefore expected to commit other crimes in Jamaica, his birthplace. The notice didn't mention Garvey, though he returned under similar circumstances in 1927. The fact none of the links that Howell had with the Garvey movement was mentioned, and perhaps this was due to the lack of information, but which for a newspaper also meant a lack of interest. In any case, Howell in due course exposed the fact that he was the victim of stereotyping by the press, that the story in the Gleaner was a fabrication, that he was not deported because he was a degenerate or a career criminal. In almost no time, Howell became the founder of a religious movement, and one with strong social, political, and economical commitments. In fact, his leadership of the Rastafari movement would also be used by the press to embark upon a more aggressive campaign to suppress him, which began after his transformation into a leader of Jamaica's black people. This same leadership role into which Howell had put himself was also responsible for the investigation that the police conducted into his part in 1936, an inquiry that uncovered that he had returned to Jamaica in exchange for his release from prison, but that he had been convicted of grand larceny, which had served as a way to undermine his career as a businessman, and had spent 18 months in jail out of a sentence that was longer based on the kind of charge that he had faced in court. Where he was jailed was not revealed in a police report, but more than likely he was imprisoned somewhere in or close to New York City, where he was living, running his tea room, and where he had embarked for Jamaica in November 1932. The point is also that by the time the Jamaican Constabulary Force came around to investigate the Howell past, he was already in jail on the island for sedition, along with his assistant Robert Hines. This conviction came 2 years into Howell's leadership of the Rastafari movement. In essence, what Howell did, which landed him in jail for 2 years at hard labor and Hines for 1 year, also at hard labor, was the crime of encouraging black people in Jamaica to pledge allegiance not to the colonial government or to Imperial Britain, but to the emperor, to the Ethiopian emperor. And during this trial, it was reported to Chief Justice Robert William Lynn Grant that Howell had been abusing the king and the queen, Queen Victoria, in fact, everybody. Howell's sentencing had taken place on the 15th of March 1934, and since he was the main target of the attempted suppression by the colonial government, its police, and its court, he was given the harshest of the two sentences handed down by Leonard Grant. 2 years instead of the 1 year given to Hines, who was a secondary target seen as having been influenced by Leonard Howell. The Howellites had insisted that their leader was not a thief. They acknowledged that he was charged for grand larceny, but insisted that this was due to the fact that he was selling folks medicine from his tea room in Harlem without the required license. He was arrested, they claim, because of his subversion of the pharmaceutical establishment in the United States. Although there does not appear to be any documentation to support the Howellites' claim, we do have his discovery that Howell did in fact open a tea room in Harlem, and it was from here his followers claimed that he sold the folks medicine. We also know, based on his finding, that Howell did not overstay his time in the United States, which again negates the Gleaner's claim that he was deported for this reason. Hill has stated that Howell had taken out his first papers for citizenship in the United States in 1924. In other words, Howell had started the process to regularize his immigration status in the United States in the very same way same year of his arrival in that country. And even though imprisonment would have put a stop to such an application, this becomes a consideration only if we accept that a prolonged period of 7 or 6 years in the 1920s was the time that it took for immigrants to gain citizenship in the United States, which was not the usual practice. Immigration problem could not have been the reason for Howell's return to Jamaica in 1932. It was Howell Street meeting that had sparked the reconnaissance by the colonial police force in Jamaica. It was Howell Street meetings which had sparked the reconnaissance by the colonial forces in Jamaica. In order to gather the information that was used in his conviction for sedition in 1934, Howell began holding these meetings in Kingston and St. Andrew between December 1932 and February 1933. Eventually, he realized that the police had him in their radar and decided that he should change the location of his meetings to the eastern parish of St. Thomas. He began holding these meetings in the parish capital of Morant Bay, but also in Port Morant, Seaford, Trinityville, and Front Hill. Why he chose to relocate to St. Thomas is not difficult to explain. This was the parish in which the famous Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865 had erupted. The leader of this rebellion was also a black preacher, Paul Bogle, a deacon of Native Baptist Church, the same church that later came under the influence of Bedward, who had helped to create the context in which Howell could start his movement. Shortly after returning to Jamaica, Howell to start his movement shortly after returning to Jamaica. Bogle, like Howell, was a leading figure in a religious organization that had started in Jamaica among poor black people. Like Howell's Rastafari movement, the Native Baptist Church also used the Bible. But unlike Bogle, Howell saw the promised return of the Messiah as fulfilled in the rise of the crowned prince of Ethiopia, Rastafari, as Ethiopia Haile Selassie. Like Bogle, Howell adopted the idea that religion should be used for earthly liberation. A notion known as liberation theology, and which was based on a new translation of biblical hermeneutics, which located the purpose of religion in the experience of the worshippers for these Christians. Religion was not for worship and fellowship alone. It was also, and more importantly, the divinely approved engine of social, economic, and political growth. It was the will of God in action. Politics really is religion, and religion is politics. Well, politics is not religion, but religion is what politics wanna be. Because politics wrought with corruption. It's in religion as well. It's both hand in hand. Yes, sir. Indian social economy. The police and the colonial government were the ones to react to Howell's decision to relocate his meeting to St. Thomas. The police had followed him there to gather more information about his activities and then brought him to court for sedition on the basis on this information. The trial, which was held in Morant Bay, the capital of the parish where Howell had been hosting most of his meeting, showed that everything about this trial was about Howell. Alright. About his preaching, organizing, and leadership role in the Rastafari movement. The crime that he was charged with warranted a trial at the High Court in the island's capital of Kingston, but the government sent Lyle Grant to St. Thomas, where Howell had relocated, where most of his meetings were now being held. A trial in that parish sent a clear message that Howell was the government's target, and to dispose of the case effectively, Lyle Grant was sent to preside over the trial. Not only was he the Chief Justice of Jamaica, he was also an experienced High Court judge who had presided over the trial of other blacks who had committed acts against British rule, acts seen as sedition or treason. The freedom fighters of Nyasaland, the British Protectorate of Central Africa, were tried by Lyall Grant following the 1915 rebellion that was led by Reverend John Chilimbwe, who also funded the Providence Industrial Mission, a church that had been active in struggles against the British in Africa. Lyall Grant served as judge of the High Court in Nyasaland before coming to Jamaica. The decision to use him at Howell's trial was not difficult, and he made more than adequate use of the opportunity, registering the government disapproval of Howell's activities by concluding the trial within a week. Swiftness was part of the government's plans of action, one carefully thought out in order to deflate Howell's importance, and Lyall Grant made sure to avoid a long trial, which might galvanize support for Howell. Another strategy was Lyall Grant's denouncement of Howell as a fraud, which the Chief Justice could do because of his own time in Africa, and which he also referred to while handing down the sentence of Howell and Hines. Howell had stated selling postcards for £1 each with the image of Selassie as passports or as tickets into Ethiopia. This act was used against him at the trial, allowing the Chief Justice to claim that Howell was a fraud, and it gave the colonial court another justification for Howell's suppression, since there was no record of him ever being appointed as an emissary of Ethiopian monarch in Jamaica. And earlier during the trial, when the evidence was being heard, the reports collected by the police advised that Howell had been promoting himself to the point where he was seen as a prophet, a healer, and a redeemer of poor black people. Information which was in a song that the police had heard Howell's people singing at one of his meetings. Leonard Howell seeks me and he finds me. Fill my heart with glee. That's why I am happy all day. For I know that Leonard Howell is doing for my soul. That's why I am happy all day. Yes, sorry. So that one the part of no name, no need for serious regard. We're gonna read another chapter here as well. So that's what we can, go through and get on with it. No need for serious regard. Yes, my brothers and sisters, it's a little insight into Leonard Howell, given the fact that it's his birthday and things like that, So, the early attacks on Howell. Anthony Boggs has established a link between the Rastafari and the radical African tradition, which had roots in Ethiopianism in the United States and the Back to Africa movement of the late 19th century, and both inspired by Ethiopia's defeat of Italy at Adwa in 1896. However, the suppression of Rastafari leading figures began before he started preaching African radicalism, before his promotion of the subversive notion of the divinity of Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Howell's suppression began on the day after his return to Jamaica in 1932, when the island's biggest newspaper, the Daily Gleaner, published a notice of his arrival. This newspaper, to put the event into context, was established in 1834 by Jewish Jamaican brothers Joshua and Jacob the Cardova. Their father ran a coffee plantation in St. Catherine Parish, and in the same year as the abolition of slavery, his sons established the island's most widely read chronicle, which would in time provide daily accounts of the new society to be created in the aftermath of African freedom. Sorry about that. I mess up there. So no need for a serious regard. The only outcome that the colonial government intended when Howell was put on trial for sedition was his suppression. But almost no mention was made in the charges brought against him of the Rastafari movement that he had started. The focus was on statements that he made in his speeches at his street meetings, which were said to have been seditious. Hines accompanied him to prison, but also because he had participated in spreading Howell's message of loyalty to the colonial government and imperial Britain. The unintended outcome of the trial was the revelation, based on the after the trial inquiries by the police in 1936, that Howell followers had lost confidence in him as a result of his imprisonment, and that a split in the organization had become apparent. The conclusion of the police was that the movement had lost very considerably in number and influence, and that the present need not be seriously regarded. As far as the police and colonial government were concerned, the Rastafarian movement was dying rather than gaining strength due to Howell's incarceration back in 1934. However, Howell's opponent outside of government decided not to share the official views. Reports at the Gleaner, for example, felt that Howell had done more than enough to create a viable cult, meaning one of those deviant social movements whose beliefs and practices pose a threat to the social order and the peace and safety of society. An onslaught of articles in the Gleaner followed alleging disturbance caused by Rastafari people and sensationalizing the growing movements while deriding it as a cult. Rasta down there asleep, Gleaner forget locked down, and sue the historical damages in Rastafari as a group, Well, I tell you to Rasta. Some people just get paid for just keep the thing in silence, Hey, Sizzler, man, I burn a fire upon you one of them day you're getting a big dirty boy. Anyway, continue. Read about the real general. Some hungry belly, never see come see boy. We come solid the movement of later with them dirty, deprived, greedy belly. When I used to not none of walk behind Babylon and yes sir, no sir, madam. Oh, I know what kind of award you get from politics the other day, yeah. Fly batty Sizzler. You don't see it. You don't see it. Sure. Be seriously regarded. However, all opposing outside of government think otherwise. An onslaught of articles in the Gleaner followed alleging disturbance caused by Rastafari people and sensationalizing the growing movement while deriding it as a cult. Even from behind the prison bars, the Gleaner reported concluded Howell was still a menace to society and his influence was growing. He was blamed for the harm Rastafari advocates were doing in the East Parish and the St. Thomas Wars and the Rastafari cult. Members of the public had also joined the cause for Howell's suppression from even before he was sentenced for sedition. They knew of no one else in the movement who could be blamed for its sudden appearance and its apparent growth. It was perceived by ordinary citizens such as Maud Ray, a woman from St. Thomas, that Howell was responsible for infecting other people in Jamaica with the strange idea of his Rastafari cult, which happened because they had been listening to Howell's speeches. To express her dislike for Howell, Miss Ray had given two policemen, Constable Enos Gale and Corporal Ebenezer Brooks, access to her drawing room so that they could overlook one of Howell's meetings in St. Thomas and took careful notes of what he had been telling the people. This evidence was present at Howell's trial for sedition. The policeman also told the Chief Justice that they had attended Howell's meeting in consequence of information that they received from members of the public who they preferred not to name. Most of the time, the members of the public who supplied the police with the information that led to Howell's arrest for this decision were not named or identified in any other way. Therefore, it is difficult to determine whether the majority of these informants were white, colored, or black people. Miss Ray was apparently the only name ever mentioned during the trial, and some of what was said about her suggests that she was a person of some means. She lived in a house with a drawing room, implying that she was at the very least from the lower middle class, but she could have been black, white, or colored. And at this late period, the latter could include even people who were partly of Indian or Chinese descent. In addition to Miss Ray, another complainant who was identified but not at Howell's trial was an off-duty district constable from Seaport, Robert Powers, who was almost surely not white and who, based on his occupation, belonged to the lower middle class. Powers was the self-appointed leader of a small gang comprised of his nephew and 3 friends, which in August 1934 had assaulted a woman, Delrosa Francis, who they had identified as a member of Howell's Rastafari, following him go at a woman in a Rasta. It is important to note that the Powers acted without any orders. He served summons on Francis and her witnesses for disturbance of a peace, as well as for assaulting a policeman. In the case of Francis, the resident magistrate who presided at the trial felt compelled to report the district constable, whose actions were potentially bad publicity for the constabulary, as well as the colonial government. The magistrate ordered to postpone the trial from 8th of August until the 22nd of August, and then reconvene downstairs in the courthouse. In other words, the trial reconvened downtown in the courthouse. In other words, the trial was disposed of quietly. C.C. Woolley, the colonial secretary, was approached by Francis and his witness after they were sentenced to pay a fine or to serve time in the general penitentiary, which was not in the parish. Writing to Woolley, Francis and her witnesses cited their wishes for unfair justice, but Woolley's response was that taking the matter to the Court of Appeal would prove futile. 2 letters sent in 1936 delivered the same message, that the public had reached into tipping point and was ready to take matters into their own hands to permanently put to rest the problem of Leonard Howell. Since the government seemed unable or unwilling to take further action, what was most upsetting to one of the writers of these letters, who chose to be anonymous and who wrote to the colonial official in London, believing that the government of Jamaica was not able or willing to take a decisive stance against Howell, was that the Ethiopian menace, as the writer calls Howell movement, had disturbed the peace and safety of the white and high-colored folks of Jamaica. This implied that the writer's ethnicity or cultural attachment. If not his or her race. And this writer added that the reason why whites and high-colored were upset was that Howell had encouraged his people not to see themselves as subject of Great Britain, which also implied that the writer felt attached to Britain and was more than likely white or high-colored himself or herself. The other letter writer, V.R. Cameron, had no reservations about stating his name for the record, even adding that he was a pastor from Front Hill, St. Thomas, one of the area in that parish where Howell had been active. Cameron addressed his letter to the Governor Edward Denham and advised him of the injustice which Howell followers in Front Hill had been facing due to the action of a certain Baptist minister who was once pastor of theirs, but who got against them and told the leader of his group that he will use his influence to see that this group movement is brought to nothing. Then I sent the letter to Woolley for investigation, and the latter brought in Commissioner Wright to order an inquiry by the police. But it was Cameron who was investigated, not the claim that he had made in his letter. And based on these findings, Cameron was denounced as a troublemaker and an impostor, someone who was not a recognized minister of any church. The official response to Cameron from the colonial and the first casualty of Rastafari, that, one of the first, Cameron was denounced as a troublemaker and impostor. The official response to Cameron from the Colonial Secretary's office told him that after inquiry, the government is not prepared to interfere in the matter. The government was able to use these findings not to take any more action against Howell, at least for the time being. And since Cameron in his letter had implied something that was worrying, that Howell was competing with preachers from the traditional churches for followers, and apparently he was seeing success, which was now causing even a Baptist minister to become concerned. Rastafari. The Baptist Church had a long history of aiding blacks in Jamaica and was very active in the struggle against slavery, which partly implied that Howell had enough charisma as a preacher to attract followers from even this church, and partly because he had created a doctrine that was sufficiently powerful and enticing. One of the stimulants for the complainant in these letters was a promise key, which was published in the year before the letter was sent, and had enough to further infuriate Howell's opponents, but also a sufficient amount of anti-colonial and racial rhetoric that could have Howell's movement more attractive to make Howell's movement more attractive to Jamaicans, poor black people. The book denounced the Roman Catholic Pope as Satan the devil and as head of a hypocritical religious system. These statements made Howell seem fearless, and perhaps among the most fearless of the warriors who had been fighting for the rights of black people in Jamaica, which include Bogle, Bedward, and Garvey, leaders who were also themselves celebrated by the black majority. Howell was even bold enough to castigate the practitioners of the folk tradition known as Obia, who were feared by most people. Howell warned that there would be no admittance for Obia dogs in the barnyard, Rastafari's house of worship, to his followers. Howell was not afraid to make enemies, not afraid to do what he thought was necessary to grow his movement. His opponent, on the other hand, became even more anxious about his leadership and expressed more eagerness to suppress him. Jaja. We are going to stop it there, so.